Good evening, class. As you know, my name is Dr. Sabri E. Ellis, and I will be talking about the legalization of weed from a sociological perspective. So today we'll look at the legalized cannabis as a major social change in the United States and in Canada. We'll compare sociological theories to see why each country approached it differently, what the results were, and how social institutions shaped the change. So the United States has a long and complicated history with cannabis legalization. And like a lot of US lawmaking, it's patchwork. It's based solely on the states for the most part. So legalization started at the statewide level while federal prohibition still holds. So Colorado and Washington were the first to legalize in 2012. And between 2012 and 2019, several other states followed. But the fight goes back much further. California tried to legalize with Proposition 19 in 1972, and Oregon led the way on decriminalization in the 1970s. So the federal government, they kept pushing back. Nixon's war on drugs and Reagan's Anti-Drug Abuse Act and the earlier 1937 Marijuana Tax Act all reinforced prohibition. Still, at the state level, activism never stopped. So grassroots organizers framed legalization around racial justice, economic opportunity, and public health. By 2009, the Ogden Memo, which was created by the Obama administration, they even admitted the federal government would not prioritize prosecution in states with liberalized policies. So from a conflict theory perspective, which is centered in like Marxism, criminalization disproportionately affects marginalized communities, like people of color, like people who don't have as much money, the impoverished communities, people like that, while legalization reflected growing resistance to those inequalities. It was legalized nationally in 2018 under Prime Minister Trudeau. Prohibition had been in place since 1923, but Canada moved toward reform earlier than most countries, legalizing medical marijuana in 2001. So by the 2010s, it was clear that prohibition wasn't working. Organized crime had grown, especially in provinces like the British Columbia and Ontario, where large illegal operations were tied to international drug trafficking. And the Canadian Drug Policy Coalition also documented how prohibition fueled criminal networks rather than reducing them. So the government framed this legalization around public health, safety, and economic benefit. So as an author described, he described the most appealing argument in favor of legalization is the increased tax revenue that it would bring to the Canadian economy. So behind me, this is a map of the United States where you can see that all of the states that are in orange, and with with Canada has a national rule that allows for recreational marijuana to be sold. Legalization provided stability by reducing black market activity, generating revenue, and creating a safer, regulated market. The way that it happened was shaped and controlled by political elites like Trudeau and his party, who framed the debate and managed the rollout. So Canada, even though they took a very decriminalization-based approach. So conflict theory helps explain why the United States and Canada frame legalization differently. So in the United States, marijuana reform was closely tied to racial disparities in policing and a long legacy of the war on drugs. Grassroots activists demanded reform because laws were hitting Black and brown communities. The conflict wasn't framed around race, but rather around organized crime. The government presented legalization as a way to reassert control and reduce the influence of criminal networks. In the United States, for example, it created jobs, generated tax revenue, and reduced the burden on the criminal justice system. But in Canada, it stabilized society by regulating youth access, improving quality control, and funding public health programs. They have nearly $5 million worth of cannabis sales that have been happening as of late. Whereas even Los Angeles as a whole is almost at 1 million by itself. So social changes were necessary with these two countries because people were constantly using marijuana, whether it was legalized or not. It was out of control. Some states were pushing for decriminalization, but people of color were disproportionately affected. So there was a lot of politically motivated, racially motivated policing, which would disenfranchise people of color. Another layer of tension came with the Ogden memo in 2009 that I mentioned earlier, because it was confusing. Like the memo stated that federal prosecutors cannot prioritize marijuana cases in states that had legalized it, but it made so much confusion rather than clarity. Organized crime groups were also a growing concern, especially in provinces like the British Columbia and Ontario. By legalizing, the government could regulate marijuana quality, cut into the black market, and frame legalization as a public health issue. So in the United States, several factors drove the marijuana reform. So grassroots activism, such as the ACLU, they underscored the disparities that were happening with people of color versus the majority. So state ballot initiatives also gave citizens the power to push legalization forward. Prime Minister Trudeau, he drove legalization as part of a broader health and harm reduction agenda. His goal was to stop having kids use it and stop having organized crime related to marijuana use. The media also shaped public opinion in both contexts, normalizing marijuana and exposing injustices tied to prohibition. Economically, cannabis became a multi-billion dollar industry by producing jobs, tax revenue, and new markets. They were also focusing on reform, and it opened space for rehabilitation and restorative justice, specifically around marijuana-related crimes. So all in all, this is what Canada's marijuana sales look like. As you can see, they are making upwards of, they have packaged almost 80 billion